first thing, or one of the first things that he notices is Marx's dialectic. And he goes, oh, this relates to, or it can be related to yin-yang thought. Okay. And what's really exceptional about Chinese civilization is expressed in many respects by yin-yang thought, which is an articulation of a very fundamentally different way of thinking, orientation of thinking, whereas it's based on the principle of harmony, or the principle of and, whereas in the West, it's the principle of either or. Fundamentally, what we generally describe as Aristotle's law of non-contradiction. So the Western logic is predicated on the law of non-contradiction, and Western Eastern Chinese thought is based on the unity of opposites, completely opposite values, right? Starting points, ontologies, or epistemological foundations. But in any event, so when they're looking at Marxism, what they see is a way of thinking that can be cynicized, but can also be used to strengthen Chinese ways of thinking, so that China would be able to compete with the rest of the world without completely losing itself the way Japan did. And bear in mind, they were very familiar with what had happened in Japan, because a lot of those young men had gone to Japan to study that model to try to figure out if Japan had the solution for China. So this is where Heidegger makes the mistake. He's drawing his observation from the Japanese experience, whereas China will in some way, through socialism, through the Marxist dialectic, be able to preserve, to some extent, this idea of being that we might otherwise describe as being in the world. And that's being strengthened now, and they're trying to return to this in some sort of way, through concepts like a shared future for humanity, the Global Civilization Initiative, and so on.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, how in many ways this idea of the civilization, so to speak, really, I guess, start to come to grips with the complex moment that we're in, between who we are as humans, our relationship to the world around us, the environment at large, and whether we continue treating it as a resource to exploit, but not in a way that says we'll just go back to the edge of the Black Forest and sit in our log cabin, but recognizes that technology is part and parcel of who we are today, and it has to be re-articulated. We must have a relationship with technology that is not the relationship with technology that the guys like Heidegger feared.
Or that the guys who run Google or Apple want. Yeah.
Which in many ways is the same, isn't it? It's just become subservient to the algorithm or the platform, or where your behaviors really are just shaped by your persona within a mathematical complex.
Right.
Yeah. So the work that you're doing now on civilizations is a very natural part of this question of technology society, isn't it, or technological society. And if we take that thought process from a China experience, how do you see that amplifying at a global level across many different historical experiences?
Well, let's approach this from what I think Western listeners who don't understand China very well, let's approach it from what they might think is the starting point, which is that China is seeking to use tradition as a justification for its political system, but in a negative way. But also China has a global ambition of ruling the world. What's interesting is that China struggles, it conscientiously struggles. I'm saying the top leadership struggles, intellectual struggle. People who are living their lives, maybe they subscribe to one narrative or another, but they struggle with the intersection of modernity and progress and tradition. Right now, in the United States, where I'm from, this is sometimes reflected through culture wars, right? And China tries to avoid culture wars, but nevertheless, there is something exceptional about Chinese society and Chinese civilization and Chinese political economy, but the government doesn't want that tipping into what Western critics would call Chinese exceptionalism, right? So how do we acknowledge what is unique and special about China? Because we need to do that in order to create solutions that actually work for China, right? But also, maybe through all these thousands of years of continuous civilization, we might also find some wisdom that would be useful for the rest of the world to survive the growing crises like the pandemic, which China just survived, right? Yeah. So at the same time, China is not interested in ruling the world because it understands that it cannot. It understands that it cannot because no one else has been able to do it. Other countries that had tremendous advantages in terms of their position in history were unable to do it, right? And we live in an era now where the United States cannot even conquer and hold Afghanistan, one of the least developed countries in the world, right? So how are you going, what sort of realistic perspective would have you thinking that you could go out and in some way rule the world, either through hegemony or force, right? But the second reason China knows that it can't rule the world is because its political system is not portable. Now here I would make I make a kind of a silly comparison. Hinduism is not something that you can transfer to another civilization. Buddhism you can transfer. We can see Buddhism moving to China or Vietnam or Japan or wherever, right? Cambodia. You can find Buddhist, New Age Buddhist in the United States or Europe. But Hinduism only goes where Hindus go. Because Hinduism is I know there are a few people, a few little pockets here and there, but largely it doesn't have the ability to transfer like Buddhism does, because Hinduism is based fundamentally on caste. Now I know I have arguments with the Indian consul for culture all the time who says it's not really based on caste, but actually maybe not theologically based on caste, but in terms of social practice, it still is, right? And Buddhism in India itself is substantially influenced by caste, but outside, it is able to be free of it. But the Chinese political system depends on a type of political organization that cannot be replicated elsewhere. So the Chinese don't think like the Americans think, oh, we can take this idea of liberal democracy and just transmit it to anywhere and it will work for anyone. The Chinese don't believe that, firstly, but secondly, they also believe their own system can't be sent somewhere else, right? But furthermore,
of a universalized notion of what it is to be, isn't it? That the American liberal version has a view about individuals, if you will, that can be universalized, whereas the Chinese way of conceptualizing being is not open to that kind of universalization.
It's not only not open to it, it has an ancient value that precedes it, and that they have been able to sustain to some extent as a site of resistance to the modern concept of being that emanates from the West, and which has always tried to subjugate China in one form or another. So it's not surprising that China would say, wait, no, that's not really what we believe in or what we want. Certainly it's something that leads to ruin. But the key point here is, if you understand how the Chinese political system works from Xi Jinping all the way down to the neighborhood committees, okay, it's the most advanced, developed political system in the world. There is none that surpasses China in terms of organization or size. That's just a simple fact. You cannot export that model somewhere else. And you can't sit in Beijing and then rule others effectively.
If we used Foucault's kind of language to describe this, the kind of self-cultivation that you need to be a participant in this ecology, so to speak, this political or governance ecology, really has to draw from deep cultural and historical roots to make sense. You can't be this kind of being.
Inevitably, that's the case, right? So China has always maintained that you have to develop solutions that fit your condition and situation, and certainly that are attuned to your cultural values, right? This is, and we can find this way of thinking throughout Chinese Marxism. One example would be Mao Zedong's concept of the mass line, from the people to the people. If you want to mobilize the masses and get them engaged in a mass politics, so you can leverage your nation up and resist this aggression coming from external forces, you have to mobilize the people in ways that speak to what they want and need. In other words, you need to know what they want and need, and you need to offer them a means for achieving that, keeping in mind that they will be asked to make sacrifices for those. But you can mobilize them towards those ends as long as you know what they want and what they need. But you also need to play the role of the vanguard, where you're trying to explain to them, this is what's going on in the wider world. These are some of the things that we need to be moving for. So they're not just looking at it as the frog in the well. They have a bigger perspective, and then can say, okay, yes, you're working in my interest, and I can support what you're doing. And this is a type of democratic development. So I'm not trying to segue yet into our discussion on democracy, but nevertheless, this is what we see, I think, happening in terms of China saying, yeah, I don't want to control others. And I also know that I need to have good relationships with other people, because we still live in a competitive nation-state world. We still live in a world where the United States is trying to small block build, trying to leverage countries into its anti-China containment policy, trying to encircle and suppress China, as Xi Jinping has said, with a technology blockade, but also by bringing more and more military resources into Asia, including, some people say selling nuclear submarines to Australia. I say nuclear proliferation. All you have to do is wreck one of those submarines on a seamount near the coast, and you have a nuclear problem, which we almost had here a couple of years ago when the American nuclear submarine wrecked on a seamount on the Chinese continental shelf. But nevertheless, I'll go ahead and let you refocus the conversation.
Well, in many ways, this conversation draws a bit from the Taoist sense, which is you just got to let the water flow, right? But this idea of the mass line as a signification, if you will, of Marxism, I guess, does lead us into thinking about this contemporary model around democracy with Chinese characteristics, if you will, and how that not only works organizationally, but I guess, again, I'm coming back to the sort of cornerstone themes of this discussion, at least in my mind, which is about the kinds of beings that we are in relationship to technology and the world around us. And this piece around social governance and participating in decisions about our world does require certain kinds of sensibilities as beings to be cultivated and worked upon. And of course, through modern technologies, ways in which we can use them to become more competent democratic beings. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you know, a couple of points here. The first is we've already noted that thinkers like Leo Strauss were influenced by this and said that liberal democracy was simply a game that's played by elites to manipulate the masses into thinking that they have control. Right? Where that becomes really terribly evident is, you know, unquestionably evident, is when we see Republicans and Democrats working together to strip away responsible financial regulations that lead to the global financial crisis of 2008, which, as we know, starts in the United States, or where we see the various collusions between the parties in terms of their return to an aggressive imperialism through the war on terror, but then immediately pivoting towards China to continue yet another war in one form or another. So, but then I'm reminded, and this is I'm making reference to some points that I made in the speech I gave at the third International Forum on Democracy that was in Beijing here this past Wednesday. And there I reminded people that Theodor Adorno or Max Horkheimer in The Dialectic of Enlightenment had argued that Nazism was in fact a logical development within the Enlightenment tradition. It was in some ways the fulfillment of the Enlightenment tradition. Whereas the Italian communist Amedeo Bordiga points out that liberal democracies and popular or populist fascism or fascist populism, depending on how you frame it, are really just two different methods for mobilizing the masses for war. And oftentimes they are reacting to each other. But what they share in common is this basic logic that comes from the Enlightenment tradition and the radicalization of this law of non-contradiction that, you know, produces cogito subjectivity or, you know, ego subjectivity and this idea of modern man, which, you know, all these other thinkers are concerned about. So this is to say, and then I go back to, in that same paper, I went back to Rosa Luxemburg, who talks about Europe being at the crossroads. And of course, she's writing this in the Junius pamphlet in 1916, when Europe is neck deep in the First World War. And she says, we have a choice. We can move towards socialism, which, let me just say, to some extent would be closer to the concept of being in the world, right? Or we can slip backward into barbarism. Like civilization can decline to where it's no longer at a stage that we would necessarily call civilization, but is something pre-civilizational. And she describes this as the the possibility of Europe becoming increasingly becoming a graveyard, a civilizational graveyard, which, by the way, has happened historically more than once. But nevertheless, she says that she takes this idea from Engels, and Engels is adopting it from another writer, and someone says, well, it doesn't really come from Engels, it comes from Trotsky. Anyway, these are pedantic academic discussions. I asked the question, and Engels raises this point, but Luxemburg says, can you really have democracy if your system is based on exploiting your own people? Can you really have democracy if your system, in the first instance, privileges private property rights? Right? Can you really have democracy if your foreign policy is about aggression and dispossession? Right? And can we say that the United States foreign policy has been democratic? Not at all.
Yeah.
Right? So, the United States still suffers from tremendous inequality and minority suppression and poverty, even extreme poverty, so forth and so on. So, so then this raises the question for me, where from the Marxist tradition we say, well, maybe the West, which many people mistake in the United States in particular as being the best examples of democracy, maybe they're not democratic at all. Maybe they've never been democratic, right?
Yep.
Maybe they are a pseudo democracy. Now, again, you go back to the Marxist from the 20th century, and they were talking, okay, we're really democracy and they're not. So this isn't the new point, right?
Yeah.
But let's just be clear. There is a compelling argument there that they created this facade of democracy, but it hasn't really served their own people or the greater good of the world, but instead the opposite, right? Whereas China created a system that has lifted 800 million people out of poverty, eliminated extreme poverty, established a middle income group of more than 400 million, has become the global leader in green innovation and green development, has pushed out globally and started the Belt Road Initiative, which is becoming the biggest positive contributor to development in the global South. All of these things are coming from China. So it's a democracy that is taking care of people within China, but is also pushing out and trying to find win-win solutions outside. Now, does that mean that every business deal or every development project is always the best example of a win-win, or there's never some? No, but what we see is that on the whole, it is much better than the alternative, right? So in this sense, we might say, in fact, where we see operationally or instrumentally in democracy is in China. And what we see is this then trying to create more democracy in the world. And in tandem with this, saying this must include things like recognizing civilizational differences, because we must recognize each other and give mutual respect. Otherwise, we're not really being democratic. We don't have that threshold. And at the same time, we won't be able to construct solutions together that not only solve problems that you have, but problems that we share.
So China's sense of democracy really draws on, in a sense, that idea of the unity of opposites, as opposed to the either or that you find far more prevalent in both the philosophical traditions of the West, but also how that manifests itself in practical terms in democratic systems, which is all about choices either or, as opposed to finding ways of bringing unity to opposites.
If you want to see where the dialectic, this is again a reductive example, but if you want to see where the dialectic is at work, the Chinese concept of civilization has two concepts, right? One, Chinese civilization, and two, human civilization. Chinese civilization is part of human civilization, but also in some ways distinct within, okay? But China has to belong to human civilization and has to work with the rest of human civilization, and indeed is a substantial part of human civilization. So you can't be at war with human civilization, and you can't be at war with yourself. So you have to find some way to recognize that if you are Chinese, you are Chinese, but you're something more than Chinese as well. You can't deny or negate your Chineseness, but you also have to take responsibility for your place in the larger part of human civilization. And that's difficult to do, but this is where there's a real constructive effort being made, as opposed to, well, now that the end of history thesis has failed, we're resorting to Huntington's Clash of Civilization again. So the either or, it's either this or that. Was no, that doesn't work. All that leads to misery and despair, right?
So in a sense, trying to rise above, that Übermensch idea, but in a macro sense, it's to realize that we're subordinate within the big picture, but we can only understand that when from time to time we have a vista from outside and above.
Well, I would say, and I'm going to be somewhat direct here. Let's avoid the term Übermensch, because that's a nasty, nasty word. He really means that only that term is based solely on the idea that the masses are unable to move together, and that it's only elites who therefore must find a way to manipulate the masses to serve the
But that idea of people having an awareness to be able to see themselves as part of a bigger picture.
The opposite of that is the idea within Marxism that collectively we can begin to foster a critical consciousness.
Yeah.
That is not subject to various normative ideologies that aim to reduce us or exploit us or alienate us, or leave us victim to forces that we perceive as being greater than ourselves.
And how do you think that plays out again through this question of technology? That there is, so you touched on Google and Facebook and things before, where their algorithms really work very hard to atomize people and then aggregate them in very particular ways that are narrow and tribal, whereas the kind of ethos that you're describing again creates the possibilities of addressing beings' relationship with technology in quite a different sense.
Well, I don't want to get too cute, but one of the observations about capitalism is that capitalism works on the principle of fragmentation. So how do you break groups into smaller and smaller units? How do you even break the individual down into a fragmented, so that I have competing interests and I'm not even able to represent my own best interests, right? And therefore I become more vulnerable to exploitation. We can see that logic at work in terms of how the algorithm works in Google, right? But where I would have taken the conversation is why does China have the Great Firewall?
I was going to head there, but let's go. Yeah.
And most people in the West believe it's because the party wants to restrict discourses or narratives that run counter to the party. Well, of course they do. Donald Trump would like to restrict those things as well, right? But that's not the primary reason. Or if it is the primary reason, it's not as narrowly self-serving as some people suspect, right? Every country that doesn't have a Great Firewall in one form or another, is now a data colony of the United States,
Yeah.
and China is not. So Chinese leaders had the foresight to know that if you are a data colony of the United States, you are subject to hegemony and imperialism
And so
online in the data world.
subject in a very pernicious and um, infinitely deep way, isn't it? Because in a sense, it gets right to the microcosm of every nook and cranny in a society.
Well, what's really funny, of course, is that before the United States became obsessed with TikTok and Chinese EVs as potentially being sources of spying and drones or whatever, Americans were really very much concerned about Google. You know, the extent to which Google was spying on people, and the extent to which Google and other big technology companies were collecting their private data without them knowing it in various ways, and then selling it to people like Cambridge Analytica, who were then using it to manipulate elections, right? And so there was this fear of American technology, and I remember even my father, someone had given him an Alexa as a Christmas gift, and he was really excited. He's always been at the forefront of technology. He was someone who was building and installing computer systems in companies back in the late 60s and early 70s when he worked for NCR. But then he became increasingly aware that Alexa was listening to everything that he did, and that Amazon could be collecting that information and using it to manipulate him, or to sell it to others who might manipulate him in ways that he didn't have direct control over. So he unplugged it and threw it away, right? So conveniently now we have the specter of Chinese technology. Oh, it's fine. So it's kind of distracted people from the much closer and much bigger threat of American technology companies, which, by the way, don't want China entering the market because they don't want to compete with them, right? And then Western politicians are saying, well, you don't allow our products to enter your market, right? But one of the things that China says is, well, you know, after 9/11, you passed the Patriot Act, which allowed the US government to enter these servers and get this information from these American technology companies whenever they wanted, right? And we don't want you being able to do that in our society, right? By the way, China wasn't the only country that had this problem. Saudi Arabia had this problem with BlackBerry, and said, you either locate your servers in Saudi Arabia so we can secure them, or stay out of our market, right? And BlackBerry refused to move servers to Saudi Arabia, so BlackBerry became illegal in Saudi Arabia. Apple was presented with the same problem, so in China. And so what did Apple do? They built servers in Guizhou to comply with Chinese security laws, right? Tesla was presented with a similar problem. Okay, so Tesla found a technological solution. TikTok obeys American security laws, and TikTok is separate. The TikTok operations and the TikTok servers are separate from the rest of the Chinese system, and yet it's demonized as a Chinese company that can be used or exploited by the Communist Party in order to spy on young people, or even use it to manipulate popular opinion. Right? It's all nonsense. It's nonsense. But even if there is some risk, pass a law that all technology companies have to abide by, including Google, right? Pass that law, and then let TikTok or whoever else decide whether or not they want to follow that law and stay in the market or leave. Don't simply say this company is illegal because it's a Chinese company, right? There's no real logic there. And what's really being protected, of course, are the big American technology firms, which not only want to remain unrestricted in the United States, they want to remain unrestricted as much as possible internationally. And this is why the United States has refused to cooperate with China on data and privacy security, refused to cooperate on AI. But we see the opening for this possibility of cooperation between China and the EU, because we also know the EU has been savaged by these large American tech companies, and they've tried to fight back with massive fines and laws and regulations, right? But they still remain very powerful because there's no real way to stop them at this point. So China built this great firewall in order to protect itself from this type of outcome. Now, I don't know whether or not they foresaw, maybe they did, probably they did, how this would eventually intersect with the relationship between big data and AI, and how AI now is, if we follow the people, there are some people who say AI is nonsense, but nevertheless, the consensus seems to be that AI is the next revolution, as the Chinese Marxists call it, a new quality productive force. But that now whoever has access to data and information, big data and information, has a competitive advantage in AI applications, right? Now, there is a question that I've raised, and I don't know enough about the technology to answer it, but is there a qualitative difference between Chinese AI and Western AI? Is there something produced in Chinese civilization that might, or Chinese big data that might give AI different insights?
Yeah.
As opposed, but I guess not, because my sense is that AI is based on a linear computer logic, which is really unable to think in a dialectical way, or a way that is really consistent with yin-yang thought, even though it can try to emulate it by copying what other people have said in those veins.
Yeah. Well, I guess AI can only have one particular kind of being in the world, and it's not necessarily either a fully embodied one or an immersive one, and it is also one that has emerged out of a 50, 60-year tradition that has had a very particular view about what intelligence is, and that has this idea of, you know, the unity of opposites and those sorts of ideas of how we are in the world and how we develop knowledges about the world.
Well, what's interesting is, you know, one thing we haven't touched upon, and I don't think we have time to touch upon today, is, you know, the generational changes that we've seen in China, and the generation gaps that we've seen, and these, you know, changing people fundamentally as they grew up in a market society, and at the same time experience the rapid technology or digital revolution. Starting with the 90s generation, the Zhou Ling Ho, but then really accelerating with the Ling Ling Ho, where there is a profound gap between the young and the old. And the question as to whether or not young people today have more in common with their Western peers than their own government leaders or parents. I think this is a concern that Beijing has, and certainly they're trying to reinvigorate certain types of social values and cultural values and civilizational values, not just to express this to the rest of the world, but also to their own young people. And I see these narratives resonating with young people to a certain extent, but it remains to be seen how that's going to be resolved. But nevertheless, they have also now been subjected to this sort of ego subjectivity, and now they're experiencing alienation and depression and other conditions similar to you know, what we see in other developed countries. So this is something that the Beijing leadership is very much aware of and is thinking about, sort of the total approach to addressing these concerns. That said, when I lecture, I talk about AI, and I raise a lot of critical questions about AI, and my students assure me that my questions are passé. In other words, they say, no, AI is just a tool, and we can use it to translate. We can use it to write papers for us. It's just the new generation. You're just being an old head. You shouldn't be worried about whether or not we're using AI to write our papers. That just means that we're at the cutting edge.
Or don't be worried that we just become the object of AI, that we're actually the tool for AI itself, right?
Or that AI, everything that we give AI, we don't own. Whoever owns the AI owns it, right? Of course, my university, ECNU, has just pioneered an AI teaching assistant. And we know that AI is being used in the medical field. So I know that one Chinese company, for example, iFlyTech, is at the forefront of that in China, where they're using AI, especially in small clinics or hospitals in rural areas where maybe doctors are not, they don't have the same level of specialization that you might see in some cities. And so AI is assisting them with diagnoses. And of course, for a long time, we've seen computer assisted diagnoses in the US, although that's driven largely by malpractice insurance, where every thing that the doctor, every question that the doctor asks, and every thing that the doctor prescribes has to be filtered through a computer to make sure that he hasn't made a mistake that would lead him vulnerable to a malpractice lawsuit. But nevertheless, it is playing those sorts of roles in positive ways. But I am concerned about. There are many people in China, especially in the humanities, and I have close relations with them, that are concerned that the main problem we face in China today is encouraging creativity. And I don't fall into the ridiculous trap of saying that Asian people are not creative or they're not innovative. That's nonsense, right? That's racism. But China did, and not unlike Korea and Japan, did invest itself in what eventually became, I think, a runaway train in the industrial model of education, which does run the risk of producing tools, people as tools to serve tools, right?
Yep.
And what we see today is that a lot of young people, when they graduate from university, they don't want to be entrepreneurs. They don't want to take risks. They don't, what they want is a job with a state-owned enterprise or the government. And they want security and so we need to find ways. This is probably of all the creativity and all the innovation that we have happening in China today, if we find a solution to that problem, we will see an explosion. Like what we have seen so far is only a tip of China's potential, right? And so that's the main question. And a lot of us think that the real problem there is the Gaokao. And there have been dozens of attempts to reform the Gaokao since the 1980s, and they haven't been successful yet. But they are doing some things and slowly chipping away at it, and we'll see what comes of that.
Look, I just want to, I guess, in a sense, double back to where we started. And this question of creativity, it is a kind of persona, if you will, or a kind of way of being. And you mentioned Kierkegaard right at the outset, and the idea of, the Kierkegaard idea of living life fully by being fully committed and those sorts of things and taking risks, etc., etc. I guess if we could wrap up with some of thoughts around risk-taking, technology, and I guess this model of being in the world that is at the intersection point, I guess, between this sort of Western idea of being an individual and the either-ors that we spoke about, and this greater sense of the unity of opposites. I mean, it's a big blancmange, complex things, poorly articulated by me, but I hope you get the sense of that little space that I'm hoping you can give us some thoughts on.
So, I'm half Danish, so I have a genetic disposition to be sympathetic to Kierkegaard. But, and that's a joke. My kids are half Chinese, so that means I'm half Chinese too. But nevertheless, the Kierkegaard is interesting. Let's just get him out of the way, because Kierkegaard went to Germany to take Hegel's lecture. And he was so repulsed by the Hegelian dialectic that he went back to Copenhagen and wrote his first book. He wrote it in Danish, but the English title is Either Or. And what he says is, Hegel's logic is the logic of and. The problems of modern man are problems that can only be solved with the logic of or. So, you know, we recognize Kierkegaard as the father of existentialism, and existentialism is one manifestation of this type of radical ego subjectivity that is consistent with the cultural hegemony of the law of non-contradiction, capitalism, nationalism, so forth and so on. So let's get Kierkegaard out of the way. And what I would do is say, let's go to a different thinker. Let's go to the first Black American to earn a PhD, W.E.B. Du Bois. In about the same year, it was a year or two before maybe, that Okakura wrote his book of tea. Du Bois wrote The Soul of Black Folk. And in that book, because after he finished his PhD, he went to Germany and he studied Hegelian philosophy and he learned the dialectic. And then later, if you know Du Bois's life, in his later life, he becomes a Marxist, he becomes a communist and moves to Africa.
Yeah.
Okay, abandons the US. But in The Soul of Black Folk, he introduces a very interesting concept, double consciousness. And what he's trying to explain in his context is what it means to be Black in America. He says, on the one hand, you live in a society dominated by white values. And if you don't understand those values and how to survive in that society, you won't survive. Okay. But you also have to understand that that society in some way negates who you are as a Black person. And so you have to cultivate, you can't allow your understanding of white society to dominate your own self-understanding. You have to develop a separate type of consciousness, right? And then you have to struggle between these two forms of being in order to survive. Now, I would argue, and I have argued, that this is what the Chinese accomplish in modernity, in so much as they have to learn the West in order to survive the West, just like Black people had to learn the white world in order to survive the white world. The Chinese had to do the same thing. But but they could only really save themselves if they didn't lose themselves to it. Yeah. Now, you have another thinker who talks about this, Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask, or maybe I have the title backwards. I read the book 30 years ago. It's been a while. But speaking more broadly from the African experience vis-a-vis European colonialism, I think the trick today is, you know, as I said to you before, the struggle to reconcile your idea of Chinese civilization and Chinese being with a broader human civilization and human being. This requires the exercise of double consciousness. And you have to constantly mediate between these two things without falling too far into one or the other. Now, there is a parallel to this. There's a parallel. And this parallel is misunderstood by a lot of Marxists in particular. In Marxism, we see the same basic logic at work. On the one hand, Marxism, or Marx and Hegel, they both fundamentally agree in some respect with Immanuel Kant. that there are two ways of thinking, what Kant called analytic, or what in a general non-normative way we would call linear, which is based on Aristotle, or dialectic. Now, Kant says the dialectic is the logic of illusion and that it's metaphysical juggling. But Hegel says that's understandable because we didn't really develop the dialectic in the West, and it was always sort of nonsense in the West. So then Hegel sets about to, develop it as a form of thought, okay? And then Marx says, okay, well, Marx discovers the material dialectic in so much as he discovers the reason why we have capitalism and the reason it looks logical to us is because it has risen in the absence of dialectical thinking, where linear or analytical thought is so culturally dominant that we are unable to see how stupid capitalism really is, and so we take it as sensible. So if you really want to be a good Marxist, in fact, you have to use both forms of thinking. Marx doesn't say get rid of the analytic. He doesn't say get rid of science. He says, okay, this allows you to see some things. The dialectic allows you to see some things. And to be fully human, to really actualize your full intellectual capacity, you have to be able to think in both ways, right? However, sometimes there will be contradictions between these two ways of thinking. And then you will have to struggle with those contradictions. However, the analytic or linear way of thinking is unable to deal effectively with contradiction.
Yeah.
So your overarching logic for reconciling the dialectic with the analytic has to be dialectical. Okay, that's why the Chinese, whether they recognize it or not, that's why they became Marxist. Because they could bring that analytic in, but preserve and strengthen the yin-yang with the materialist dialectic, okay? And then move forward, all right? But there's a constant struggle between these two different ways of thinking, just like there's a constant struggle between different ways of being. Right? Now, this struggle was not unfamiliar to the ancient Chinese. Why does the Tao have this symbol of the black and the white, okay? It's to tell you, you think you see difference. You think you see black and white. You think you see male and female. And a lot of Westerners, they like that symbol because they think it represents, from the Western perspective, a certain type of duality or dualism, either or, black, white, heaven, hell, good, evil. No. You're supposed to imagine that you're looking down at a cup of coffee. Let's imagine it's a cup of swan. What do they call it? What's the Vietnamese word for cafe? I can't remember it right now, but the Vietnamese coffee where you have the heavy condensed milk in the bottom, right? And you imagine that you got that very black coffee and you pull that up and you see that white, right? And then you stir it, right? Imagine the Tao, the symbol of the Tao is you're looking down at that cup of coffee, and what you're supposed to see is the swirl, the mix. You are supposed to remember that you think you see black and white, but it's actually ever-shifting shades of gray.
In movement.
That's reality. The constancy of change and the unity of opposites. Okay. So this is the way of thinking that where the ancient Chinese were recognizing, yes, there are individuals and there's men and women, but what we really have to most strongly emphasize in order to have a good, happy, healthy civilization is how we're all together. Not how we're different, not how we're segregated, not how one is good or evil, but how we're all together. Now, I know there are some people who say, yes, but didn't some people take the yin and the yang and say one is good and one is bad and one is male and one is female? Yeah, there have always been fools in history who've exploited things with bad ideas. But if you really go back to ancient China, there's no such thing as a pure woman or a pure man. The man will have some feminine qualities, the woman will have some masculine qualities, right? Why did the peasants value women so much? Because their center of gravity was lower. they could stand bent over in the rice paddies much longer than men could. They were necessary for your survival, right? To have a strong wife was necessary for for you to be able to eat. They could labor in ways that you could not, right? And so you recognize the strength of a woman and value the strength of a woman, right? But without subjecting it or subordinating it to your own strength, because they could do things that you could not. And yet they were also participating in the same human being. This is another interesting thing that we see in the Book of Rights. In the Islamic tradition, in the Christian tradition, in the Jewish tradition, I know there's slight deviations depending on which specific whether or not you're talking a Baptist or Catholic or Shia or Sunni or Orthodox or Reformed Jewish, whatever it is. But broadly speaking, within those faiths, there's a single ritual for a funeral. There's a single ritual. Whether you're the Pope or the cleaning woman at the Vatican, there's a single ritual. Now, one may be more ornate and have more dignitaries, but it's the same basic ritual. Confucius spends a large part of the Book of Rights trying to give us the right ritual for burial. And he can never give us one. Never. So he gives us many different examples and tells us what's good and bad about these different examples. And they're all conditional and situational. Right? Why? Because when the person dies in the West or in the Islamic world or the Jewish world or wherever, you have a ritual because that person is dead. You're not dead. They're dead. And so we have one thing that serves that dead body. And all dead bodies have something in common. They're dead. Okay? But in the Chinese tradition, if you have a being in the world and we're all together, when someone dies, literally part of you died. Now, I know we say in the West, part of me died when my child died or my mother. No, that's just a figure of speech. And maybe you're unhappy or literally, if you understand your social organism and your own being as being something collectively shared, when that person dies, part of you died, part of your collective being. So then you have to construct a right that represents who that person was within the community, so the community can mourn their death, right? And who that person is, so it's the crown prince or it's the chambermaid, okay? And it's not just this. My favorite example, he says, there's an example where the crown prince dies and the whole kingdom has to go through this long, prolonged period of mourning and so forth and so on, right? And he says, this is right because the crown prince has a relationship with the whole society, and it's necessary for everyone to acknowledge this because this is the fabric of ritual for making sure that society works well together. He goes, but then there's an example of a king who's passing through enemy territory. His entourage is passing through enemy territory, and his son dies. Well, you can't stop and have this long ritual. And I can't remember exactly the thing that the king does. He dismounts, he circles his son's body. I'm not speaking necessarily the exact detail from the Book of Rights, but something like this. He circles the son's body 3 times, bows 3 times, gets back on the horse and says, let's get out of here. And everyone's like, yes, right? Because the well-being, the security of the entourage depends on not exposing yourself to your enemy, right? And Confucius says, good ritual, good ritual. It responded to, it was based on the situation and the needs. But again, this helps demonstrate like a difference. So the Chinese knew that there were individuals. They knew that there was, but at the same time, they were emphasizing the idea of a collective or social being and a being that was also part of the world. okay, and how we were supposed to relate to each other. And Lao Tzu is talking about this in one way, and Confucius is talking about it in another way, but it's all trying to express this fundamental idea of being in the world, which is really quite different from the West, which is always emphasizing the individual and man over nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, perhaps on that note, Joseph, we've spoken for a lot longer than originally planned. And there's a lot of things that I'd love to pick up on another occasion, particularly.
Well, I see a lot of the books behind you, and they're all very familiar. So we're certainly in the same neighborhood of intellectual preparation.
This is part of my bookshelf, and I do cheat because I'm actually in my office, but it is my bookshelf from the library upstairs. And but the office wall is a little bit boring, so this is a bit more interesting. But yeah, look, let's pick up at some point in the future on some of these threads. I think some of the key takeouts for me on this is how some of the big picture stuff also comes back down to questions of individual cultivation, but then reflects back onto these broader concerns around the current state of the world and the kinds of tensions that exist that we have to work through. You know, this idea of being singular, but also being with. You can't be yourself without being with others.
I think the key here is just to tease a future conversation.
Yeah.
I think the key is China does not want to be a threat to the United States. And I don't believe in the Thucydides trap. I think that's ahistorical nonsense. But we have to understand that the United States is in a period of serious decline.
Yeah.
And maybe has already collapsed. Right? And what we just see is this sort of momentum that is driven by the continuing power of the dollar and the ability to deficit finance military and social programs, right? And then externalize those costs from the rest of the world. That means that the American way of life depends on being able to assert a certain type of hegemony and imperial privilege, which China, as a rising major power, says we simply can't accommodate that any longer. We don't want to overthrow you, but we don't want you manipulating and controlling us anymore. And we've gotten to a point in time where you can't do that, and we're just not going to let you do that anymore. But the U.S. system necessitates this. So the strategy that I see at work is, you know, there was some idea that maybe China would collapse. We always had this collapse thesis in Western thought. And the last great fantasy of collapse came before Xi Jinping took power. There was this hope that the gridlock that had opened up between the factionalism of the party would lead to some sort of political failure. Instead, what happened is what normally happens in China in the modern period under CPC rule. They reach a crisis point. That crisis point then becomes itself recognized as the primary contradiction, and they change themselves. They reform, right? They just have this capacity for adaptation. Sometimes they reform before they need to, and sometimes they reform at the last minute, right? Now, does that mean that they'll always be able to do that? Not necessarily, but so far that's been the trend. And people who don't even like the party, like David Shambaugh, have written books detailing this point, even though Shambaugh lost his mind. And I say that with him being a former professor. Now, once it becomes clear that Xi Jinping has been able to rectify the party rectification campaign, the real objective of that is to push through long-delayed structural reforms for the economy that had been gridlocked between the Tuanpai and the Shanghai factions. And so right as he's consolidating the anti-corruption campaign, and it's clear that they're going to start moving forward with those, the U.S. launches the trade war. And in my mind, this is a deliberate tactic aiming to make it more difficult for China to push through those structural reforms, because the objective here is to push China into the middle income trap like the United States did with Japan in the 1980s, right? Now, that's not going to work ultimately, I think, but it has slowed China down, as has the technology blockade. I think the United States knows that it won't work, that they know that neither the trade war nor the technology blockade that they will engineer solutions to, and they are a system built precisely for solving those kinds of problems. And as a technological society, that's where they surpass all others. Okay, so that's going to be resolved sooner or later. So what is the United States doing? What comes after that? And this is where things become very much darker in my mind. And I don't say this as a certainty, I say this as theorization. I believe that the US is playing a strategic endgame with climate change, that they're trying to weaponize climate change. This is central to my analysis of the conflict in Ukraine, but also to why the United States reemerged as established itself as the leading oil producer. The close relationship between oil and the dollar, why it has reasserted American hegemony in Europe. Just before the war in Ukraine, I'm not being conspiratorial here, there was talk between EU, Russia, and China of doing energy transactions without the dollar, right? So all of that is threatening the dollar. And if we understand that the US economy is a house of cards built substantially on the power of the dollar, then we understand that the US is at a potential inflection point where they could lose everything, right? So they are staring at some type of apocalyptic event, and they're terrified, right? And they recognize that in some respect, China is the biggest risk to them. In fact, China could destroy the United States tomorrow by simply saying, no more to the dollar, right? We're not going to transact in dollars anymore. And the United States knows this.
Yeah.
And so this is why the US is trying to reestablish something like a Cold War paradigm, where if you want security and if you want to do business with the US, you have to do it with the dollar, as Europe now has to do. And for a long time, Europe wanted to take a different approach with the euro, but that has failed. So anyway, this is where we are. And why? Because China, in terms of exposed capital and people, is the country that's most vulnerable to climate change. And after China, India, Brazil, Africa. In short, the global south. And who's knocking on the door of the global north? The global south. And who is least affected by climate change? The global north. Now, they're affected, but relatively speaking, they come out winners, especially if they are fossil fuel dependent economies like Russia or the United States, which then perhaps become complicit adversaries in their struggle in Ukraine, because it helps perpetuate the paradigm that they're both wedded to. Anyway, that would be the vein of analysis where I carry forward. So,
well, on that score, let's pick on another occasion, because there's a big vista there to explore. And thank you again for your time, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, sir. I hope you do too.